to other contraceptive methods. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is the mechanical method of birth control. Okay, so these pictures there are just showing the different ways that this, or the different devices that are going to be used with this method. You have condoms, you have female condoms, you have something called a diaphragm cap, and you have an IUD. Okay, so with the mechanical methods, these are methods that are going to either physically obstruct, the path of a sperm, or basically prevent a sperm from even getting into the fallopian tubes or the uterus, so that it will not come into contact with an egg. And also, either it's going to do that, or it's going to, in the case with the IUD or the intrauterine device, it is going to interact with the uterus lining in some way that is going to prevent implantation from taking place. But I'll talk more about that later on. So the first one we're going to talk about is called the diaphragm cap, also called a cervical cap. Okay, so this is basically a rubber-like material shaped like a ring, and it's basically going to, well, no, I shouldn't say ring. It's shaped, it's cap shaped. So basically it's going to be inserted into the vagina, and it's going to be placed on top of the cervix, okay? So the cervix is right here. So because this cervical cap is here, or this diaphragm cap is here, if sperm was to enter the vagina, that's going to stop this sperm from entering the uterus and then making its way towards the fallopian tubes, where we'll find an egg. Remember, this is one of the ways that we say that contraceptive devices work. They're going to prevent a sperm from reaching the egg. So that's what's being utilized with this method here. So with this method here, a person would basically have to learn how to use this. So a doctor would probably have to, show them how it's done the first couple of times. And it does have some limitations. One of the limitations is that, a person would have to actually know how to use this device properly. So they're gonna have to actually put the cervical cap inside of them and basically make sure that it fits properly, that it's going to completely cover the cervix, which is kind of difficult for, the average person. So basically, this is something a person would have to learn how to do. In addition to that, a contraceptive jelly might be applied to the cervical cap. Usually it's some type of spermicide. So that's going to give it an extra, layer of protection. Basically, spermicide is something that's going to kill sperm cells. Okay, so now you have a cervical cap that's covering the cervix, and it also is covered with spermicide. So that's going to further increase its effectiveness. Now with the cervical cap, it is effective, but like I said, a person will have to learn how to use this properly. Okay, so for some people it might be a little bit too complicated. So obviously they may not, want to use a device like this. Now, another limitation of the cervical cap, like I said, it has to fit the cervix properly. Okay, let me see if I can find another picture of the cervix. Okay, here's a picture of the cervix. All right, so basically that cervical cap will have to fit this properly to make sure that no sperm can get around it and then enter the uterus. All right, so that's basically it for the cervical cap. Next, we're going to talk about the IUD, which stands for intrauterine device. Now, with the intrauterine device, basically it's a T-shaped flexible tube that is going to be implanted into the uterus. In order for this to be done, you'd need a doctor to do this. Basically, they're going to fit this tube, this T-shaped device through the cervix. So they have to physically push this through the cervix in order for it to be inside the uterus. Now, the way how this device works is that it's going to prevent implantation from occurring. Basically, what it does, some of these intrauterine devices, they have an artificial hormone on them, and basically that hormone is basically going to change the lining of the uterus to prevent implantation from happening. Now, hopefully you guys remember what implantation is. Remember, implantation is when a fertilized egg or a zygote is trying to implant itself into the lining of the uterus. So this IUD basically works by preventing that from happening. And either it's going to release hormones, or in some cases, it basically irritates the lining of the uterus, and that's going to cause the uterus to release more antibodies. And these antibodies basically are going to destroy sperm cells or destroy a zygote. But basically with the IUD, it's going to stop implantation from occurring. Okay, so moving on. Now the advantage of this method here is that it's very effective, and it has a long-term effectiveness. So basically, once the doctor installs this or puts this inside the female uterus, it should work between 3 to 10 years. So basically, that's one of the main advantages of this. It's very long-term, and it's always going to, it basically requires no preparation before sex. Once the doctor puts this in, then a person can basically have sex without having any need for preparation, such as with the diaphragm cap. A person would have to physically insert that inside the vagina before they have sex. And they also have to do that 3 hours before having sex. But with the IUD, once the doctor inserts it, that's basically a one-time procedure, and now a person will basically be covered for the next 3 to 10 years. Okay, so that's the main advantage of using IUDs. In a case where, it's not a hormonal IUD, then that also prevents, these artificial hormones from being placed inside a female, because sometimes these hormones might have, different adverse effects that a person might not be comfortable with. Okay, now when it comes to disadvantages of using the IUD, one of the complications that can occur is called a proliferation, which basically is when this IUD is going to basically penetrate the walls of the uterus and basically enter the abdominal cavity. Okay, so basically what happens is that it tears through the uterus, and this IUD ends up going, someplace else inside the female where it should not be. Okay, in the case of that, that would be extremely painful, and a female would have to get surgery in order to remove that device. Okay, so that's one thing that could happen, which is, very high risk if you really think about it, because that can lead to infection, and sometimes infections get out of control, and yeah, that would basically need surgery in order to correct that. And once infections and stuff like that happen, there always is the risk that maybe that permanently damages a person's fertility. Okay, because when it comes to using contraception, basically people use these things to prevent pregnancy, but at some point later on in their life, they might eventually want to have kids. So if you're using a device like this and a proliferation actually occurs, then that might complicate, fertility for that person later on in life. They might lose their ability to have children. Okay, so that would be a disadvantage for a person who would want to have kids in the future. Yeah, another disadvantage of using IUDs is that it increases the chances of tubal pregnancies from occurring. All right. So with a tubal pregnancy, basically what happens is that, once this egg cell would have been fertilized from a sperm cell, instead of it implanting in the uterus, it might try to implant inside the fallopian tube. Okay, so the embryo will basically start to grow inside the tubes, and the fallopian tubes are very, very narrow. So before much time passes, maybe 1 week to 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, once it gets a certain size, that is going to create immense pain for the woman. And this is probably going to cause a miscarriage, or in other cases, the woman will have to be hospitalized. And once again, they'll need a surgery to remove that. Okay. And once again, this can be very damaging, because if you damage the fallopian tubes, that might basically prevent that female from being able to have children, later on in the future. So that'll basically damage their fertility. That's going to reduce their fertility, and they may have difficulties having kids later on in life, or they might never be able to have children again. So that's one of the complications of using the IUD. Now, all that being said, with the risk and the I guess the rewards, the IUD is still very effective. All right, but with any medical procedure, you might have complications. Now, with these complications, this might be, there might be a 1% chance of one of these things happening, but it's still, a possibility. All right, so that's not really, the necessarily scare you off from, potentially using this in life. But as with all medication or medical procedures, there are going to be, complications. So that's going to be one disadvantage of using IUDs. Okay, so far we talked about two mechanical methods. We talked about using a diaphragm cap, and we talked about using an IUD. Okay, so the last method we're going to talk about is the use of condoms. Yeah, so you have male condoms and you have female condoms. And the way condoms are going to work is basically it's going to prevent sperm from entering the uterus and thus the fallopian tubes of the female. So basically, condoms have a physical barrier that's going to stop sperm from entering the female. So the way how that works is because if you don't have sperm inside the female, then there won't be any sperm there to fertilize the egg. Now, condoms have a lot of advantages. One, it's relatively cheap, and it's widely accessible, which means that they're easy to get. All right, you don't have to go to some doctor. The doctor don't have to insert some type of device inside of you or teach you how to use a certain device, such as with the diaphragm cap and the IUD. Okay, so it's cheap and widely accessible, and it's also going to prevent STDs. This is the only contraceptive method that is actually going to prevent STDs. Okay, and condoms are also 99% effective when used properly. I'm going to put emphasis on used properly, because if a condom is used incorrectly, and there are a number of ways that can happen, then obviously it won't be as effective as it's supposed to be. So for example, sometimes condoms can burst if it was stored improperly. So if it was left out in the heat, or left inside the sun, or left inside a wallet, that may cause the rubber material to deteriorate, to deteriorate, and that's going to make it less effective. Okay, so in an incident where a condom bursts, then it's no longer effective, and the sperm would have entered the female. Also, what can happen is sometimes that a condom might slip off, which again, in that scenario, now sperm has entered the female once again. So even though condoms are 99% effective, they have to be properly used every single time in order for it to be effective. And I guess I would say that one of the, I guess, disadvantages of condom is that, people see 99% effective and they automatically assume that, once they use this method of protection, then pregnancy cannot occur. But like I said, it has to be used properly. Okay, so basically three things have to be avoided. It has to be stored properly so it doesn't burst. Also, if it was to slip off, then obviously that would no longer provide any protection. And thirdly, after the male would have ejaculated, he has to remove the condom immediately because sperm can still spill out of the condom and still get into the female, and that will still lead to pregnancy. Okay, so condoms are only going to be 99% effective if it's used properly. Now, another advantage of using condoms is that this method is also chemical free. Some people, they have concerns with using different artificial hormones and stuff like that inside their body because it might have some type of long-term effect that might be bad for them. It might cause cancer, or it might just cause, different symptoms that a person might not like. It might cause them to get more acne, different stuff like that. So with using condoms, there's no chemicals involved, so they wouldn't have to be concerned about that. Another advantage of using condoms is that there are no medical complications, such as with the IUD device, where you have proliferation happening, which is basically when uh, the device basically penetrates the wall of the uterus, and now it will have to be surgically removed because it's going to cause some type of infection. And with the disadvantages, they're listed off right there, but I just talked about, each of these scenarios. It can slip off, it might burst, and withdrawal must be done carefully after each use. Okay, now to recap what I said about the diaphragm, once again, well, another advantage of using the diaphragm is that, neither partner can feel the device. So once a diaphragm was used, hypothetically, a person wouldn't have to use a condom because the diaphragm is supposed to be there to block the entry of the sperm into the uterus, and that's the fallopian tube. Okay, so a person, they basically, I guess, have more sensitivity because there's no condom involved. And with the diaphragm, it's also a chemical-free method. It's very reliable when properly fitted. There's also going to be no medical complications because remember, it's just a rubber cap that's being placed on top of the cervix. So there's no chemicals involved, there's no surgery or anything like that, and there's also going to be no medical complications. Now, disadvantage is that the diaphragm cap alone will not protect against STD. So if a person wanted protection against STDs, they would still have to use a condom. The diaphragm cap is only going to prevent pregnancy from happening if it's used properly. Okay? And another disadvantage of the diaphragm cap is that it must be used within 3 hours of insertion. Okay, so remember I said that a person would have to learn how to use this device from a doctor. And then they'll basically have to apply it to themselves. And like I said, this has to be done within 3 hours of insertion. So once a person puts a diaphragm cap on, once a female puts a diaphragm cap on, they have to have sex within 3 hours. That's the only time that that diaphragm cap is going to be effective, because if more time passes, it might start to slowly slip off, and then that would expose the cervix, which the sperm would then try to swim through, well, through the opening to get inside the uterus and then the fallopian tube. So once this diaphragm cap is applied, a person would have to have sex within 3 hours. Next, after that, after sex would have happened, the person must still leave this diaphragm cap on for several hours after sex would have happened. Okay, so basically, a person can't just go and take the diaphragm cap off immediately after sex because they would still get pregnant. So basically, in order to use this device properly, one, this device has to be placed inside the vagina and on top of the cervix 3 hours before sex would occur. Okay, so once this is placed on, a person has to have sex within 3 hours. After sex occurs, they would then have to leave this cervical cap on for another couple of hours. So after they have sex, they can't just take off this cervical cap because then the sperm would still be able to get inside the uterus. Okay, so with the diaphragm cap, a person has to really know how to use this cap. Okay, there's certain things that they'll have to learn when it comes to applying it to themselves or inserting it themselves, and they have to use these certain rules to make sure that it's effective. So after this person would have sex, they still have to leave the cervical cap on for up to 6 hours. Okay, and it also has to be used along with a spermicide. Okay, so after the appropriate amount of time had passed, or a number of hours have passed, then they would be able to remove the cervical cap. Okay, so with another disadvantage of using a diaphragm is that I guess it's not as spontaneous as other contraceptive methods. And what I mean by that is that, if a person wants to have sex and they're using this device, they have to put this on 3 hours before they have sex. And then after sex happens, they have to wait 6 hours before they remove this cap. And they're also going to have to use a spermicide to basically kill sperm. All right, so it's not as spontaneous as other methods, such as the condom, for example, where if a person wanted to have sex, they just put on a condom. That takes about a minute, and then they can have sex afterwards. So that's another disadvantage of using the diaphragm cap. Okay, that was the diaphragm method. Now let's do a recap on the IUD method. And this right here just lists off the advantages as well as the disadvantages. Remember I said this is long. One of the advantages is that it has a long-term effectiveness, which is between 3 to 10 years. It requires no special preparation before sex, such as with a condom, where a person would have to put on a condom before they have sex, or such as with the cap, the cervical cap, where a person would have to place in that cap 3 hours before sex. Okay, so with the IUD, there's no special preparation before sex. A person could just have sex whenever they would want to without having to take any additional steps. Now, when it comes to disadvantages, another disadvantage that I didn't mention was that about 1 in 10 of these IUDs are going to be expelled in the first year of use. So basically, there's a 10% chance that the IUD will be released, after a doctor would have installed this inside of the uterus. Another disadvantage is that when a person has a period, it might be very heavy and can also be extremely painful. And also a person might have spotting, during different times of the month. And once again, two of the more concerning complications associated with IUDs is that you could have proliferation of the uterus, which can then lead to the infection. Proliferation is basically when this device is going to penetrate the wall of the uterus, or basically tear through this uterus and enter the abdominal cavity of a female. With tubal pregnancy, this is basically when implantation would have happened inside the fallopian tubes. And I would have already said, why that is, can be very damaging. One, the fallopian tubes are very narrow, so that's going to be extremely painful for the female. And that's going to lead to a miscarriage. And sometimes it can lead to hospitalization because a doctor might be needed to physically remove that tubal pregnancy. And once this happens, remember I said that this can permanently damage the reproductive tract of a female, and that might make it impossible for her to get pregnant later down on the road if there's permanent damage. Okay, so with this picture here, it basically shows what perforation looks like. Here you have, the tip of the IUD device. And like I said, it's basically penetrating the lining of the uterus. Okay, so it's going to literally tear through the uterus. And with that, there's stories of, females finding the IUD device, in their upper parts of their body, such as close to the stomach or inside the large intestine. And basically wherever this device goes, that's going to cause some type of irritation. And also it's going to cause, infection, because after the wall of the uterus was torn, an infection might take place afterwards. Okay, so that's another rare complication associated with the uterine device. And like I said, with tubal pregnancies, basically, remember what the uterine device stopped implantation from happening inside of the uterus. However, there's a very, very small chance that implantation might take place inside the fallopian tube. So basically, this embryo here is going to implant itself into the fallopian tube, and then it's going to try to, grow into an embryo, at which case, like I said earlier, that will either cause a miscarriage or a doctor would have to physically remove that by using surgery. All right, so that's it for a presentation for today. So far, we only covered mechanical methods. So the mechanical method and the natural method. So I will cover chemical methods and surgical methods in another video. All right, so that's it for today.